So, ladies and gentlemen, we will start our second and final panel of this seminar with Ambassador Mihna Motok, and he is the Deputy Director of the European Political Strategy Center of the European Commission. I'm sorry. And this is, for those who don't know, this is the in-house think tank of the European Commission. Ambassador Motok was previously to being Deputy Director of the Center. He was a permanent representative at the United Nations, at the European Union, and also at the European Union and at NATO. And he was between 2015, 2017, right? He was a former Minister of Defense. So I would give the floor to Ambassador Motok to address the topic implementation plan for security and defense, current and future prospects for European defense. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, General Viana, Professor Ferreira Nunes, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Lisbon. I just realized we are in direct link with Porto as well. I have excellent souvenirs of Porto too, and maybe I should start by saying something more encompassing and contradicted something that apparently Maria de Medeiros once said. I like to dream about Portugal, she said, and it's less easy when I'm there. Unlike her, me, I can do both. I can dream about Portugal while here and away. So it's good to be back here, especially at a time following a year, 2017, which apparently has been the best on record this century for Portugal. And I'm therefore very, very thankful to the Institute for giving me this opportunity and for inviting me. So while it is true that the European Political Strategy Center I represent here is the in-house think tank of the Commission, I find myself today in the company of some true Brussels-based, first-rate think tankers, the two gentlemen from the first panel, Daniel Fiot here, so I think it's wiser for me to keep my remarks rather broad than deep. And I'd like to briefly take you through a little bit of stock taking on European defense and say that recent times have been great, have indeed been outstanding for European defense. And the single most important thing that accounts for that is or was the fact that for the first time ever, member states truly came together in delivering in these very sensitive policy areas of security and defense. Yes, of course, they did that prompted by every evolution that was going on within us and around us, Brexit, the arch of conventional and unconventional instability around us, the repeated appeals for Europe to take more of its security in its own hands. And yes, it is true that this was done prompted also by a large majority of European citizens who sensed the need for and supported more Europe in security and defense. Yet, although it should only come naturally that we cooperate and integrate more on security and defense as we do across so many other policy areas in the European Union, and although the treaty holds provisions on CSDP, on common security and defense policy leading up to even common defense for a long, long time, in spite of all this, we all know it was far from being easy to accomplish such a feat, and I think Portugal is even best placed to know how challenging it was. So this was an impressive consensus, the one we've seen delivered essentially last year over European defense and security, but impressive that it was also a consensus that was brought about by a sense of urgency and by a sense of pressure. Indeed, we were working against a clear in a race against the clock if we were to deliver on these huge expectations of European citizens to get better protection from the European level. And first, I think what was clear was that we needed to take up the present-day shortfalls and gaps in our defense capabilities, but also in our forces' interoperability and deployability. And why was that? First, because let's face it, defense budgets in Europe today, while they have barely recovered after many years of dramatic shrinking, they are not, military expenditure in Europe is certainly not going to jump up in the same way as US, Russia's, China's, India's, and others. Military budgets can actually spike up. And that's also due to the fact that in spite of the reality that Europe is still the world's second largest military spender, collectively of course, Europe's defense still suffers from many inefficiencies. And I would say, I would list as the chief inefficiency among these the fact that the primary, the elementary fact that member states are not really cooperating on defense, or certainly they are not cooperating by default. Let us recall that 80% of defense procurement and 90% of defense research and technology is still run exclusively on a national basis. And what we are losing out because of this lack of cooperation and because of fragmentation is, according to a minimum estimate, an annual 25 billion euros. Some are even talking about much higher orders of magnitude in the like of even up to 100 billion euros. On the other hand, conversely, only if we were to pool procurement, only if we do that, we would save annually not less than 30% of defense expenditures. So what was needed was actually to bring about the reflex for substantially more cooperation on defense. And for that reflex to come out, because that reflex is let's admit it, it's simply not there in most our member states. So to bring that reflex about, we needed to obviously incentivize it politically and financially. And I guess we all saw very clearly at the end of 2016, the wheels of change started to get into motion, and in 2017 we saw the tide really changing. And the amazing thing about it is that member states' political support and buy-in in this process was so far commendably unwavering. I'm quite sure that this was not going to be, and this is not yet another false attempt at European defense, for the very simple fact that that we cannot afford that anymore. And as I think Sven Biskop quite aptly put it, this time it is different in many respects. I'd single out three key developments in that regard in 2017, which actually laid down major cornerstones for European defense. As you can suspect, first of them is, of course, the famous sleeping beauty from the Lisbon Treaty, namely PESCO. This metaphor was coined by the President of the Commission, President Juncker, but in fact it was the leaders of 25 EU member states who have made it really come true. And PESCO comes with a lot of promises, and it has a vast potential. First of all, to me, PESCO is a policy framework that is capable of taking CSDP as we know it to the next level. Then, of course, it is an amazingly sophisticated and complex compromise between inclusiveness and ambition. How it works is that by generating strategically aimed cooperative projects, it promises to not only address current operational shortfalls in both national settings as well as in our EU missions, but it also promises to support the Union's strategic autonomy in the future. And really, PESCO has the potential to make the European Union into a well-rounded global security provider. Now, Professor Biskup spoke extensively on PESCO before me, and he's coming up with an excellent piece on PESCO. I don't want to say more about it. It has a very catchy name. I strongly recommend this is an excellent read. So I'd only add two small points on PESCO. First, on how it is so far implemented. The putting it to work progresses nicely. As you noticed, there's been already approval of a first batch of 17 initial projects. A second wave of projects under PESCO is to be coming very soon, and a decision on PESCO project governance is imminent. And I'm more than pleased, and we should be more than pleased, that Portugal has signed up to no less than 6 of the most advanced and complex of this first batch of 17 projects. My second point is that obviously PESCO is no panacea, and its potential will not be coming through unless combined with the other tools we have at our disposal. And these other tools are, these two other tools that are so important in this context are the European Defence Fund and CARD, the Common Annual Review of Defence. In as far as EDF is concerned, let's be honest, generally speaking, achieving enhanced defense cooperation would remain wishful thinking only unless fueled by appropriate financial incentives to make participation into it attractive. And to a great extent, the same logic stands true with regard to PESCO as well. And here, the Commission stands ready to decisively step in and put real money to supplement and amplify national investments. And I'm very glad to report that we have already signed the first contracts providing grants for collaborative research in innovative defense technologies and products. And please make no mistake, this is money that's coming out directly and entirely from the EU budget. And we're also geared up to start quite soon, pending adoption of relevant legislation, to start very soon creating incentives for member states' cooperation on joint development of prototypes through co-financing from the very same EU budget, with a significant bonus of up to 10% for projects that are undertaken in the PESCO framework. Then we're fortunate to also have CARD out there. CARD should help us move away from the present situation where 28 national armed forces are employing no less than 19 different types of aircrafts, no less than 37 different types of APCs, and where you probably noticed there's more types of military helicopters on offer than national governments to actually buy them. So much for easily mounting joint operations, so much for interoperability, maintenance, and operation, and these are all crucial factors for military planning, not to mention the enormous financial implications. So CARD is a first step, only a first step, towards putting an end to such a situation and to such a waste. CARD is now under a trial run. It is being tested for the first time, with the aim of allowing all of us to to look into each other's spending plans, to identify where the shortfalls are, but also where the new opportunities for cooperation would lie, so that we are able to generate those capabilities that we have already identified and prioritized jointly in the CDP. Maybe I don't need to say this again in front of such an audience. You are quite well equipped to construe the fact that a stronger Europe on defense cannot be but an enhancer of stronger NATO. But I feel nevertheless compelled to recall the fact that we have been going through all these accomplishments while at the same time taking EU-NATO cooperation to a most unprecedented level. And just recently, 34 new actions have been added to the long list of areas over which we cooperate already with a significant degree of success. And some of these 34 measures are actually addressing truly far-reaching challenges, like, for instance, military mobility or the information sharing in the fight against terrorism. And since I mentioned military mobility, just last month, an action plan on military mobility was jointly unveiled by the Commission and by the High Representative. And I'd say that clearly adapting the national infrastructure, the norms, the national norms, standards and procedures that would allow a rapid and smooth transfer of our troops and of our equipments across European borders is clearly something to be addressed at European Union level. And I can tell you that we at the Commission have a relatively clear picture of the pressure points where decisive action is needed, and we also determined that the corresponding financial implications of addressing those needs are not really quite insurmountable. Now, we will only have to trust that the financing of these needs gets the right politics around it, especially in this decisive stage of the negotiations over the next MFF. So I guess that by now we will all agree that we have actually taken a quantum leap in European defense, and that there is enough scope for us to be reasonably optimistic about the future, that this is no utopia anymore, and the train of European defense has actually left the station. Yet, looking at the road ahead of us, I would say that the mightiest enemy we have from now would be complacency. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of things that still need to be done. I can easily list 5 of them. The first one being the fact that we are crucially, vitally dependent on the continuous and steady political will and support of member states. Why is that? Because what we are embarked on is actually a vastly different paradigm change in terms of how we cooperate on defense, because we need to understand what it takes today to be sovereign as far as defense is concerned, and because we need to maintain the strategic steer that our leaders originally gave to this renewed effort to European defense. Then we still need legislation to be adopted, and we still need an adequate multi-annual budgeting to be approved. And last but not least, of course, we need projects. We need good projects. For that is what would take to have concepts like PESCO, like HARD or EDF, actually transform into realities. And we also need the design of new and more ambitious missions, a goal we also set jointly for ourselves. I'd say that at least 2 sobering realities that were there at the start of this process, of this new endeavor on European defense, are still out there, if not even in an aggravated form. One of them is, of course, the global security picture, which is still tense, if not even tenser than before. One needs only to look at the fact that in our days it is still possible that a country like Syria is war-torn for no less than 7 years, while at the same time drawing extensive and complex international involvement from within outside the region. And we also have to see that as the country is turning down to ashes, its regime does not hesitate too much in employing chemical agents against its own population. So do we need to look even further than this tragedy? I think we could do, but with quite fast get depressed. The other sobering reality is the ongoing race for what is called the weapon systems of the future wars and the advent of military applications of structural technological changes in the like of artificial intelligence, quantum leap, big data, unmanned vehicles, and so on. These are obviously hugely expensive developments to keep up pace with, and again, let's face it, Europe is lagging behind by many years, if not even decades, in these departments. Should I add here to the list of needed things the fact that European defense will also have tasks in relation to fighting terrorism and countering cyber and hybrid attacks or challenges. So the point I'm trying to drive at here is that we should look at all the accomplishments so far, certainly not as an end, but as the foundation bricks of a future European Defense Union. Now, what would this European Defense Union be defined like? I guess the most common sense definition of it is that this would in fact make sense out of all these developments combined. This would bring together a dedicated, adequate and predictable budget for European defense, a functional, capable European force, proper. Most probably it will commence by a rapid reaction force. This will bring together a card that will grow into an actual defense planning instrument, a European defense planning instrument, MPCC, the military planning and conduct capability that would evolve towards headquartering all of our more ambitious set of missions, and the PESCO that is bringing CSDP to the consequences that were intended for it by the treaty in this policy area. And obviously, the kind of defense capabilities that are needed to carry out the full set of missions required to protect Europe, European Union and its citizens, but also required to support our quest as remaining a global actor for good. You may wish to add to that the gradual development of, the needed gradual development of a common threat assessment and the convergence of what is presently quite different strategic and military cultures. And if you think that this is ambitious, you should perhaps see how the EU military staff is conceiving the European Defense Union from their perspective, which, by the way, is, I think, entirely consistent with the legal and political basis that we already have for developing the European defense. Now, President Juncker is of the view that we can get a European Defense Union up and running by 2025, and we should be able to have a better view of that by the landmark summit in May 2019 in Sibiu. But as we already last year put forward in our Commission reflection paper on the future of European defense, there are 3 ways of getting there, 3 ways of getting to a European Defense Union. Some are faster, others are undertaken at a more moderate pace, some are more ambitious, others less. But one thing is evident to me: the European Defense Union we seek is a concept that's blending political flexibility and military credibility. Now, 2 brief notes on 2 European defense-related major developments just ahead of us. The first one, as you suspect, is the MFF coming up. The Commission will propose, will make a proposal on the next MFF quite soon, May the 2nd, and whilst there's still a lot of discussions around the options and choices, a few things are clear, and one of those clear things is that we will prioritize defense among the new policy areas that were agreed by member states and that need to be financed under the next MFF, and we will also provide both adequate and dedicated financing to defense. By the way, defense was among the first policies for which the Commission pre-identified, pre-indicated the level of funding in the next MFF to the tune, as you know, of 1.5 billion euros annually. The second quick note has to do with NATO, because obviously developing a credible and sound European defense rests in good part on taking cooperation with NATO at the next level. And I think the summer summits of the two organizations in June and July will hopefully come with new milestones on that road. But to me, stronger Europe on defense is consubstantial with a stronger NATO. It would defy common political logic to think otherwise, to believe otherwise, since a good part, a predominant part of our membership is common. By the time of those summits, we should, I'm persuaded, also be able to be more capable to dispel concerns in the like of the European defense implying by Europe, or other arguments that we've heard lately to a concerning degree, and to which in a short time we should be able to provide more concrete arguments that this is not the case. To conclude, I truly believe that decisively ramping up defense cooperation will lead us over time to more defense integration, to the point that this is becoming the new normal in Europe. And more than that, I actually believe that developing the European defense will be a major revitalizer of both the European project and narrative and of the European identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Mirna Motok, for this very complete update on the implementation plan on security and defense. Well, we will now pass to Daniel Fjord, who's a senior researcher at the EU Institute for Security Studies, and he's also a lecturer at the Free University in Brussels. He teaches European security with a specific focus on European defense. Daniel Fjord, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should start by thanking the Institute for inviting me here today, General Viana, Professor Ferreira Nunes, Isabel. I find myself in the rather luxurious position now, where everything has actually been said. So I could, in fact, constrain my comments to maybe 2 minutes, but I'll try to stretch it beyond that. I think what has been said already is pretty spot on, especially, Michia, what you've just said. Let me just make a first general comment about where we have come over the last 19 months or so, starting from June 2016 with the publication of the Global Strategy, ending in December 2017 with PESCO, a very intense 19 months. I think what we see, and here I echo Sven Biskop here in being cautiously optimistic, what I see after all of these initiatives are the rudiments, the foundational principles of the European Union finally marrying the tripart concept in strategic studies of ways, ends and means. That is, having a much clearer identification of the strategic objectives of the European Union, which the global strategy gives us, but also having a number of policy processes such as PESCO, but also the European Defence Fund, which are aimed to give the European Union the means to also deal with, or to try and seek to achieve its strategic objectives. And of course, the ways is very, very important, because PESCO is a very particular political format for cooperation. The European Defence Fund is also a very innovative and a new way of cooperating at the European Union level through financial incentives. So also the very nature of the way in which the EU not only sees the world, as the global strategy makes clear, but also the nature of cooperation, defence cooperation in the European Union, is also quite different, and we should keep that in mind. What I would like to try and do today, and this very much fits with the brief that I've been given by Isabel, is to look more specifically at European defence markets. And I think what I would like to do is start by saying, or focusing a bit on this, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, the political concept that dare not speak its name, strategic autonomy. Because this is a very sensitive concept. It is one that is emotionally loaded in many of the member states and also across institutions, of course NATO and the European Union. But I think what we see, and as what has already been said in a lot of the presentations, is that we are at a strategic moment in time where the Europeans clearly need to get their act together. Now, I will not repeat what has already been said in terms of the strategic landscape, but what I will say is that from a specific capability point of view and industrial point of view, one of the dilemmas that we face at the European level is the so-called strategic lag between the relative speed at which the strategic landscape can change. So security challenges can change very, very quickly. The political timelines can also change very, very quickly. Remember the so-called events, dear boy events. You know, that can change very, very quickly. But when we're talking about capability development and industrial development, there we're talking multiple years, even decades. So there is a real onus on the European Union, especially now with the Defence Fund and PESCO, to try and make the right decisions now, with the assumption that in the next 10 to 20 years, you will need to be able to develop the types of capabilities that will actually be useful for the future of warfare. So what I would like to point to is perhaps the word complacency was mentioned. Indeed, we must, in Brussels especially, connect the policy processes, which excite us very much in Brussels, with the realities of strategy and also capability development. Let me say a few words on the capability and the market side of this. The idea of market consolidation in Europe seemed to be something that was very, very attractive only in the 90s. The pressures of defense globalization, international competition from the US and newcomers really tried or gave the incentive for European firms to push together. We have noticed over the last few years quite a level of consolidation in the missile sector and also the aerospace sector. But consolidation is an ongoing process. We see in recent times the tie-up between KMW in Germany and Nexter, the so-called KNDS tie-up on land forces, land equipment. And we also see more recently the French-Italian tie-up with STX and the naval capacity. So consolidation is an ongoing thing within the European Union. What we do have to be mindful of course, is that the structure of the defence markets more generally are changing. With consolidation comes some degree of risk with monopolization, but also, and this is very, very important, and something which in particular the European Commission stresses, that the sources of innovation in the defence market today do not only lie with primes, with the prime firms. They increasingly lie with SMEs. And SMEs which are located, such as Portugal, is one country, where they have innovative SMEs without necessarily having the prime or the system integrators. This, for Europe, regardless of the European Defence Fund and PESCO, is a continuous problem. How do you integrate the innovative SMEs within the larger supply chains within the European Union? This is something which the European Defence Fund has as one of its core objectives, to stimulate cross-border cooperation with SMEs and primes, and that is very much still a work in progress. But what is clear is that if the European defence market is going to deliver serious capability, then it also needs to be able to innovate. So we need to be very, very careful about what type of market structure we bet on. Is it just the primes, or is it also the mid-caps and the SMEs that can, play a very important role here? So supply chains are very, very important. Obviously, in Europe, we also have another discussion about export policy. This is also another very touchy subject, of course, in a number of member states, especially when you look at the differences in export policy between, for example, France and Germany, where there are clear differences there. This will also be another strategic issue that we will have to tackle, because if one looks at the European Defence Fund in particular, especially the capability development window, the capability window, obviously the end point of that is so-called commercialization. So we will need to work at some point not only on a common understanding of what capabilities we need, but also in a common export policy, perhaps, which is also very, very important. Then we also need to keep in mind what I would say are the broader shifts in military technology, and which has already been mentioned, in fact, but not just the technology domains themselves, but also how governments procure military capabilities and defense equipment. This is very, very important in light of the technological revolutions in artificial intelligence, robotics, the so-called additive manufacturing revolution, which has changed completely production cycles and production methods. These are all broader strategic shifts in industrial production, which will have an enormous knock-on effect for how Europe produces equipment and capabilities. And that's something which perhaps doesn't necessarily get neatly captured with many of the EU initiatives that have been developed, but it is certainly going to be something in the future that will affect how we produce capabilities and the speed at which we produce capabilities. And of course, I have no time to do it here, but there are whole ethical debates to be had about the involvement of artificial intelligence in military equipment, in military development, and so forth. Then this perhaps does tie in with the broader strategic discussion, and that is about the so-called offset strategy, or the, if you want to put it in more crude terms, the so-called arms race, the technology arms race between different states and different regions in the world. It will come to no surprise, I guess, to many people that a lot of the focus in the United States over the last few years has been on what military technologies they can develop to overmatch or overcome the dominance or the growing dominance of countries like Russia, but also China. So we must also be aware of the fact in Brussels that many of the initiatives which we develop and put on the table are part and parcel of an identification of capabilities, an identification of what technologies we may need in the future, and how does that fit in within the general structure of power relations, which Sven Biskop was talking about earlier on. This is also a very, very important factor to keep in mind. So European markets are changing. It's not only about primes, it's about SMEs, mid-caps and innovation. It is also increasingly not just about defense firms, I should say. Because there is also an increasing role for civil firms to play a role in the types of technologies that are being developed. Again, it's probably no surprise to learn that in the US, they have, of course, a number of firms which they can knock on the door to any day of the week, but increasingly they're looking at Palo Alto and Silicon Valley and what those companies have to offer. They're not defense firms, they're civilian firms. Now, in Europe, we have a number of firms who have both defense and civil business. The question we have for the future, especially with the Defence Fund, is to think about how we might integrate the civil and defence industrial bases in Europe, especially if we have innovation as the driving force behind military capability development. So that's, I would say, a general snapshot of the market. And it should also be said that there is an opportunity and a risk I see involved, especially in relation to the increased defence spending that has been mentioned, because it's clear that if you look at many of the data sets, the European, or the EU 28 as a whole, have increased their defence spending even over the last 3 years. The figures I have here from the IISS are in the order of magnitude of some $230 billion in 2015, that increasing to $244 billion in 2017. So there is more money coming online. The point that needs to be underlined here, and Michi, you made the point very, very well, is actually how you spend that wisely. because in Europe we still have that problem that there is still a lot of waste here. So that also needs to be kept in mind. Now, coming back to this, the dirty words, strategic autonomy. This is something to be kept in mind because it means many things to different people, especially when it comes to capabilities. I conceive of strategic autonomy beyond the so-called CSDP envelope. So strategic autonomy should mean that coalitions of member states have the capacities to act alone if needed, outside of the EU and even outside of NATO. Strategic autonomy should also mean that European states should be able to take up their fair share of the burden within NATO, that's clear, but also within an EU envelope, that they should be able to conduct strategically autonomous missions within CSDP if needed. That's the general definition that I would give. But of course, when it comes to industry, it becomes even more complicated, because when you're talking about strategic autonomy, you're not just talking about your ability to develop capabilities, you're also talking about the skills you have in society to develop these capabilities in the first place. And one of the big problems we have had in Europe for many, many years is that we've had problems, or let's say challenges, related to our skills base. It's not enough to be able to just buy capabilities for your autonomy, but more increasingly so in the world that we see, that we need to also be able to have the skills to develop those capabilities, and more importantly, the autonomy to be able to use capabilities that European countries have developed together. So that's something to be kept in mind increasingly. Now, to conclude with two general points which I hope will lead to a good discussion. What I see with many of the initiatives that have been developed, European Defence Fund, PESCO, CARD, is a sort of tension, I would say, especially in the strategic planning sense of the word, between, on the one hand, the need to meet current strategic gaps in capabilities. As has been mentioned already with the headline goals, past processes have already identified what the strategic gaps are for CSDP. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is what I've been speaking about in terms of technology, which is what are the future trends? What are the future capabilities? Now, it seems to me that when we prioritize projects in PESCO and also in the European Defence Fund, there will have to be some kind of accommodation between these two. And that will not be very easy, I think, especially when you consider that the member states have their own interests, their own understandings of this. So we will have to be very, very careful in what balance we have between filling gaps and meeting future needs. And this is not helped, I think, by, again, an issue that has been mentioned already, which is that the level of ambition, the so-called new level of ambition that was contained, or buried at the back, rather, of the 14th of November Council conclusions, the so-called annex to the annex, where you have a number of military tasks which seem very ambitious on the face of it, but are not necessarily numerically operational. It's very difficult to operate or to plan what close air support would mean, or maritime operations on the high seas. It's very difficult for military planners to operationalize those concepts. So I think as time goes by, especially within PESCO, we will need to be a bit more clearer about what these priorities mean in specific terms. This is a very challenging aspect, but I think it's the most important aspect in being able to balance between gaps, current gaps and future needs. There is also a discussion to be had, or a debate to be had, about also not so much the legal basis, but the philosophy behind many of the initiatives that the European Union is developing. If, for example, you look at the so-called EDIDP, the European Defence Industry Development Programme, there you see that there is a very clear legal basis, Article 173, for the competitiveness of the European industry. Now, from an industrial point of view, that makes sense. Also, from a European Commission point of view, that really does make sense. That's their business. However, if you have discussions with military planners, they, of course, do not rank competitiveness as the highest rank of order. For them, they want capabilities first, and not necessarily the most cutting edge. For the military, industrial considerations are relegated to the operational aspects. Now, I would say that it's a bit of a false dichotomy to say that you can only have one or the other. So if you go for operational capabilities, you lose an aspect of competitiveness and vice versa. What the EU has to try and do, I think, moving forward, especially when it tries to prioritize capability development programs, is to come to some kind of accommodation between the needs of industry, which are very, very clear. If we don't support industry soon with, let's say, ambitious programs, and Dick, in your slide, you had a number of them, the future fighter aircraft and so forth, then there is a very real risk in Europe that industry will fade away. And that would be a gross strategic error for the Europeans. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that industrial interest cannot be the only driving factor behind capability development. So that's another tension. Then I would also end on, let's say, 2 points. One is the issue of coherence of many of these policy initiatives. There is a discussion to be had about the coherence between the European Defence Fund, PESCO, CARD, so the new initiatives which have been put on the table. And there's also a discussion to be had about the coherence between the new initiatives and the old ones. The risk is that we think that European defence cooperation began in June 2016, which is clearly not the case. We have a long history of different initiatives. One has already been mentioned here today, the Capability Development Plan. The real task ahead now is to ensure that we have a proper governance structure between PESCO, between the European Defence Fund, CARD, and some of the other initiatives such as the Capability Development Plan. This will not be an easy task. This will not be an easy task to try and manage the relationship between these various initiatives. But in fact, managing this relationship is the only way to ensure that we're able actually to move towards the objective of a European Defence Union. The risk is that we would, if we don't manage governance properly, that we would have invented a whole bunch of interesting initiatives without overall coherence moving forward. And that coherence is going to be absolutely vital in the future for what I've said. What is the balance between current gaps and future technology needs? What indeed is what are the technology areas that the Europeans should focus on? And then, moving on from the industrial and capability level and kind of uniting it with the overall vision for defense. Where do the Europeans want to be able to operate militarily? Is it just in its neighborhood, or is it further afield in places like Asia? So these are questions which need to be kept in mind. So, just to conclude on one final point, I would echo the point about complacency. We have had a very active 19 months with new initiatives. The question will come, and it should come very, very quickly, bearing in mind that capability development takes much longer than any quick political decisions, that we need to get the prioritization right and to get it right very, very quickly. If we don't do that, the real danger is that we would have even perhaps used money from the European budget, which I hope and think will not be the case, to fund capabilities which in the next 10, 20 years will be of little relevance to the actual strategic needs of the European Union. And I'll end there. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this in-depth analysis on how are we going to move from goals to capabilities to industries and to markets. And I would open the floor now to our guests in this audience in Lisbon and in Oporto. Well, so I would suggest a point of, Ambassador, please, if you please. Well, here on the first row, in the middle.
Thank you very much. I am the Portuguese ambassador for cyber diplomacy. I was rather surprised by the shared relaxation of all speakers this morning with Brexit. Maybe because we are at such a periphery in relation to Brussels, and maybe because we have this old-standing alliance with the United Kingdom, we are not as relaxed as the speakers seemed so this morning. And I would like to actually ask a question to these two last speakers, whether they think that the future defense relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom will actually not require some sort of political framework which we have not dared to think of right now, but might be necessary in the future. I am referring, of course, to some sort of confederation between the European Union and the United Kingdom in the not so far future, because from what I have understood so far, there is a lot of reluctance on the part of the European Union remaining member states to actually allow the United Kingdom to continue as member of the political institutions that we have for defense and foreign policy, which of course makes some sense given the some say obstructionist position of the United Kingdom in those political institutions, or allegedly obstructive position that they have had. Not being possible probably to, but of course that remains to be decided, but in case that it is not possible to keep the United Kingdom as some sort of member with some sort of status in these foreign policy and defense decision-making bodies that we have in the European Union, wouldn't it be necessary to actually think about a deeper sort of political cooperation between the European Union and the United Kingdom in order to allow for meaningful defense cooperation in the future?
Thank you. Any further questions or comments, please? So I would suggest a further point of reflection on if PESCO somehow, and I would address this reflection to, or suggest this reflection to both speakers, if PESCO somehow would enable indeed a paradigm shift from a specific focus on crisis management to collective defense, even without the European army, of course. But for that to happen, I believe we have to have a more consolidated European technological and industrial base, and how do we achieve that? And I would connect that with another aspect, which is, Daniel Fjord referred that the US competes with Russia on technological developments regarding its defense industry. Who will be, or who are the other European others towards which we should compete in the same way the US competes with Russia and other partners on technological developments? And how will this will provide the incentive, will mobilize and drive the incentive for better cooperation among industries, defense industries, and among European markets? Any further questions or comments you wish to make? No, so I would suggest our guest speakers to, perhaps we would start with Ambassador Motok and then go to Professor Fjord.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for raising this issue, albeit I am quite sure, speaking for myself, that we are anything but relaxed with regard to Brexit and its implications on what we're doing. But I'll keep myself to saying here that we wouldn't have this conversation if it weren't for Brexit, among other things, and I'd stay at that remark. Now, for quite a long time, we the Commission refrained from prejudging the kind of cooperation we would have or would like to have with the UK post-Brexit on security and defense, because divorce proceedings were not over. So we didn't want to mix divorce and post-divorce settlement for obvious technical and principled reasons. In the meantime, while we were having this position, you certainly are aware that London came with the most positive and engaging paper on this future defense and security relationship that we've ever gotten from them. The other limiting factor in this conversation, I think, is how you construe the notion of third country. So there's many, as I think you hinted at, there's many for whom third country is third country. Namely, a country that cannot have the same status in the institutions as member states, cannot have access to EU budget, and cannot have more entitlements than a member state in a given situation. Take the case of PESCO. A non-PESCO EU country would not normally have less entitlements than a third country. Then there is the concern of other third countries, how their status might be affected by the status UK will have afterwards. So all these are for us, for the time being, reasons not to go beyond assuming that security and defense will be one of the better chapters of the future relationship between us once Brexit is consumed.
The easy question from the ambassador. No, I mean, from an intellectual point of view, of course, there needs to be much more attention devoted to what kind of framework will exist in the future. It will be sui generis, and by virtue of that, it's very difficult to tell now what that will look like. I would say, as an important aspect of whatever framework is developed in the future, that it is even more critical that the EU-NATO cooperation that has blossomed in the last year or so needs to continue, and I would actually say need to intensify, because it seems to me that we can here discuss what kind of bilateral relationship the UK and the EU27 might have on defence cooperation, but it seems to me that the one avenue or the one institutional setup that would deal with many of these issues is actually in the EU-NATO context. And the UK in particular will invest much more time in NATO for obvious reasons. Now, the politically sensitive issue is what access does the UK have to many of these new initiatives, PESCO and the European Defence Fund. I think the risk for the EU27, when they look at the UK as a kind of hybrid, funny third state, is what kind of access should it have to these instruments. My guess is that if there was a clean slate, there probably wouldn't be too much difficulty in including the UK in this somehow. But we're not with a clean slate, because the moment you give some kind of special dispensation for the United Kingdom, then of course you will have to think about what you do with Norway, and potentially also think about what you would do with Turkey. And then there's if Brexit is the elephant in the room in this discussion, the bigger elephant in the room is the US. And the US has been very, very clear on its signalling about how it sees the European Defence Fund and PESCO as a potential way of excluding the US and US industry. So this is an extremely politically sensitive issue which goes far beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid. But I think if there are a few university professors in this audience, that should be the #1 topic that they set their students. What will defence cooperation look like? What framework would you develop in the future?
Thank you very much. And one last question to Oporto, if you please.
Thank you for your presentations. If I understood correctly, there is a funding waste, and it seemed to me that it isn't a small issue. Could you share some ideas or points on how to minimize waste in defense research and industry and maximize results, please? Thank you.
I will come back to Daniel Fjord because I misunderstood and he still wants to add something regarding the questions which were raised.
Yeah, I mean, you raised two very, very important points about PESCO and what it does to the, let's say, the foundations for CSDP, crisis management towards collective defence. I wouldn't personally use the words collective defence, but what I think has become very, very clear now, and one of the reasons that is actually stimulating EU-NATO cooperation, is that there's this grey area between crisis management and collective defence. Military mobility as one project is one perfect example where the two organisations actually have to work together to address an issue which improves European security and the protection of Europeans, as the global strategy makes clear, but also to help with collective defence within NATO. So there is a paradigm shift going on, I would say, but I don't think that it moves to the extent that CSDP at some point will be responsible for Article 5 contingencies or so forth. I think the EU will just play to the strengths it has in helping NATO allies meet their collective security under NATO. There was a second point that you made about US competition with Russia and China. Well, you know, that this is a central question for Europeans to answer. It is very dangerous to identify key technologies and then to build a strategy on that. It has to be the other way around. And what the Europeans have to do is be very, very clear about their own strategic objectives, but more clearly, what type of military operations does it think it will have to fight in the future, and what technologies does it therefore need for those operations? It was the point I made about how you trade off industrial competitiveness and operational needs. What comes first? There are dangers, but I think that there is much more room for the Europeans to answer that key question. What level of ambition do you have in a very precise material sense? How many troops will it take? Do you need fighter aircraft? Do you need tanks? Do you need armored vehicles? We need to be very precise about what we need in the future. And on that basis, then we can think a bit more clearly about technologies. Of course, this is not helped by the fact that there's a blurring of lines between internal and external security. So cyber technologies become increasingly part of our thinking in terms of what we could fund under the European Defence Fund, what projects could be developed within PESCO. And I would say this very clearly as well. If you look at the 17 projects in PESCO which have been developed, it seems to me pretty clear that the Europeans do understand where their strategic priorities lie. We have cyber, we have maritime, a big chunk of the projects on maritime security, and we are essentially a trading continent, so it does make sense. What we need to do is make sure that the Europeans stick to their own strategic priorities, I think. That's the key point. And then finally on the funding in waste, as was said earlier, most of the funding for procurement and also R&D is done on a national basis. That's something which we hope with the European Defence Fund will change over time. It won't change overnight, the spending patterns and spending priorities of governments. But the hope is that with increasing incentives, you can actually ensure that you have some kind of leverage to ensure that money is spent more wisely. There is a kind of added risk here, of course, and it was very, very clearly and cleverly pinpointed by the Commission at the early stages of the Defence Fund, which is that the fund itself should not be seen as an excuse to start cutting national budgets on R&D. The whole point about the EDF and European cooperation is to actually leverage and to have a very important discussion about standardizing requirements, harmonizing military requirements for defense research and for capabilities. So you can never completely cut out waste. Just ask the US what it spends on defense. There's a lot of waste there. There's a lot of waste in many countries. So you're not going to be able to completely do away with waste. But what you can do is put in place processes and incentives that hopefully will rationalize spending in the future. But you can't have a discussion about the rationalization of spending unless you have a broader discussion about what your strategic priorities are. The two have to be hand in hand.
Yes, thank you. Can I take up the last point, and very much thank you for the question. Very much in the vein of what Daniel just said, I would add that here It's obvious a lot of scope for savings across the full life cycle of developing and using a military product. So from research all the way to maintenance and operation. The problem is that we are many of us doing the same things in our national settings. So the idea that the Commission, I have to agree with Daniel, smartly came up with was not to throw a lot of money, but to put the money where the riskiest segments of the development of a product are, namely research. You have to try to incentivize the kind of most innovative research, which is also always risky. And second, the capability development, meaning taking the outcome of the said research all the way to prototype. And this is where the most volatility exists, where you would like to have some financial backing in order to engage into taking that research outcome to the level of prototype. Here is basically where the Commission stops for reasons that have to do first with the legal basis. We cannot go beyond that, but we can, and we are actually working on supporting the joint procurement. We cannot ask member states who are collaborating on research or capability development we cannot force them to procure jointly, but we can incentivize them to do so. So that's why we are offering what is called a financial toolbox. So we are not, it shouldn't be, the European Defence Fund indeed should not be understood as an excuse for bringing down spending at national level. On the other hand, it's not necessarily asking for more spending. It's just putting the resources that until now are used through the national defense budget, putting them together with the resources of other member states and generating at the same cost more capabilities, more diverse capabilities that would also generate more interoperability and deployability. And here I think we need to address a lot of needs and of challenges. Daniel mentioned them, that we have a tendency to focus on filling in the gaps in today's capability, but we cannot afford not to at least start getting engaged into the weapon systems for the future, and also into the more security part of it, because you cannot separate defense from security. I mean cyber, I mean hybrid. So there's a lot to finance. Member states doing business the way they are doing now, mainly in national settings, will not be able to cope with this race, with all the political, strategic, economic consequences that will come for us as Europe.
So we have reached the end of this seminar, and on behalf of the National Defense Institute and its director, I would like to express our deepest appreciation to Sven Biskup, to Dick Zende, to Mirna Matok and Daniel Fjot for their very, very valuable contributions, their in-depth analysis, and very much up-to-date, which will help us to better reflect on the challenges and also on the opportunities of European security and defense. And we would also like to thank our guests for your participation and your presence on this seminar, and we look forward to see you again in other initiatives that the Institute will organize for you. Thank you very much.